So at this point, if we take this app that we have here, which we looked at before, let me clone this, and I'm going to call this Acme Offices Stores Persist demo. And let's go into that and do an npm install. And I want this to be a new repo, so I'm just going to remove the git repo. I'll say git init, npm install. So right now, we've got sort of a hybrid application. And the way that I mean that is that part of our data is stored on the server, but as we're making modifications to our days, there's no concept of a day on the server, so we're not persisting any of that data. And that's what we'll end up taking a look at. So if I go to start this, and I'll go over here and we'll take a look at where we are at this point. So right now, we've got this map that's not really doing much of anything. We have a number of days. We could go over here and we could, we're going to go over here and we're going to add a store and we're going to add an office. And that looks just fine. The only problem is that every time we end up refreshing our page, that ends up going away. So the first thing that we want to do here is we want to set up our data model so we can end up persisting this. For this data model, it's pretty simple. And the reason why it's simple is that we've got a concept of a day, and a day is going to either have an office or a store, none, or both. And it's a pretty simple structure that we could do. So if I end up, let me open this up. And let's go over here and take a look at our DB. Right now we've got an office, a place, and a store. And what I'm going to do here is let's just take a look at our office, for instance. I'm going to cheat a little bit. And I'm going to specify here that we're going to end up adding a day. So we're going to use our connection here. Let's rename this day. And I'm actually not even going to have any properties on my day. In fact, the way that this is going to work is that I'm just going to be getting my days, and I'm going to sort it by the day that they're created. So I'm going to end up getting them back in order. I mean, the way I actually added some functionality to this app that I should probably mention. I had mentioned doing this, but the idea that we could end up adding a day, and we could end up removing a day. We could add things to days, and again, this stuff will be persisted as long as we don't end up refreshing the page, in which case we go back to nothing. And that functionality is very similar to what we've looked at before. So let's actually just finish this up. This is going to be day, and this is going to be day. And let's go over here, and in our index, we'll say constant day equals require /day. And we'll specify that a day belongs to an office, right? A day has an office ID. And a day also belongs to a store. Might have one, might not have one. And let's also, in our models, return this day as well. So just going back to our, just so we could take a quick look at this. One modification that I made was to sort of group together all the different things that end up changing our state. and just put these functions into an object so we could see all the different ways that our state could change. We could select a day, we could add an office, we could add a store, we could remove an office, we could remove a store, we could add a day, and we could remove a day. The adding a day and removing a day are pretty simplistic, where if I go to add a day, I just push another day and I reset the index and I re-render my day picker. When I remove a day, I just find that index, I set the index back to 0, and I'm just putting a little bit of logic, put a little bit more logic. And by the way, I separated these out into separate files so that if we would end up looking at our day picker, we could just sort of focus on our day picker. And here, I've set up some controls to specify, hey, look, as long as my day length is greater than 1, then I'm going to allow the user to remove the day. I don't want them to be left with no days because then I have an end case that I just don't want to deal with. But I have my remove button, and here again, my this is a fairly dumb function. It's being passed in everything that it needs to be passed in. When this primary button gets clicked on, which is this button, I call on add day. When this danger button gets clicked on, and this will only be added if I have more than 1 day, I end up calling on remove day. What's nice about this structure is that everything that I want to do at this point in terms of making this persistent, I can end up doing here by making calls to my server. Now, before we do that, let's actually go and populate some data. It's always easier if we have some data to start out with. So let's seed a little bit of data. If I go to my index file here, I'm going to do a couple of things here. I'm going to also just use a little bit of ES6. So I'm going to specify, I'm going to say Statue of Liberty. Let's see the offices that I have. So I've got 3 offices. So I'll say SL office, I'll say ESB office, and I'll say FS office. And what I'll do here is that when I come in here and I end up creating my stores, I want to use my offices to end up generating some data for my days. So what I'm going to do here is put some braces here. And get myself set up, because once I do that, I have to explicitly say that I'm going to return. And what this is going to allow me to do is to do something like this, where I say, I can even call this offices. And this is kind of the magic of ES6, where I could destructure this array of offices and put in Statue of Liberty office, ESB office, FS office equals offices. So this is an ES6 sugar that basically says, hey, look, you have a collection over here. I'm going to grab the first thing, put it in this variable, grab the second thing, put it in this variable, grab the third thing, put it in this variable. Something you'll end up seeing, especially when we start taking a look at Webpack. Let's just see that that ended up working. I'm going to do console.log SL office. And let's actually do an SL office .get so it doesn't look so messy there. And here I could see my Statue of Liberty office. Okay. On the same token, let me do another let. I only have 2 stores, so I'll say SL store, and I'll say ESB store, and I'm going to do the same thing over here, so that when I end up getting over here with promise.all, I'm going to put a then in here. These are going to be my stores. And I'll go over here and I'll say this is going to be my SL store, my ESB store, and I'm going to end up getting them from stores. So it's basically a destructuring that's happening there. So I don't have to do 0, 1, 2. I could just grab them and give them a name right off the bat. And let's just see that this worked by going over here and saying console.log sl.store.get. And we can see that this is our Statue of Liberty store. So now once we have all our stores and once we have all our offices, let's create a couple of days. So I'm going to go over here and I'll specify that I want to return promise.all. And what we're going to do here is we're going to specify that we're going to do a day.create. And we'll go over here and we'll say that this is going to have a office ID, and we could really pick any of these. So we'll say this is going to be SL office.id, and we'll give this a store ID, and our store ID will be, let's say, SL store ID. And we'll do one more of these. And for our office ID on our second day, we'll specify that this is going to be our ESB office ID. And for our store, we'll say, well, we'll keep it as a Statue of Liberty store. Doesn't really matter. Okay? So let's just see that that doesn't give us any errors. And here we should have some days that end up getting created. Now, what we're going to do at this point, and again, if you're building this, you can always feel free to, well, actually, I got rid of my git, so let me add all these back in. Git.add, git.commit, commit. And what I'm going to start doing now is setting up my API, because these are the calls that I'm going to make from the client to the server. Right? So, and again, we haven't really done all that much of this. The only time that you've seen these, I think, really, is on some of the checkpoints. But what I'm going to do here on my server, I can always separate these out to separate routes. But on my server, I'm going to specify app.get/API days. I'm going to make it clear that this is going to be an API call to my server. I'm not making this call by putting this address in the address bar. I'm going to make this call by making an AJAX request after my page ends up loading. And I'm going to put request, response next. And I'll go over here and I'll say models.day, find all. Then this is going to give me days, and I'm going to specify that I'm going to say response.send days. So now what I should be able to do here is if I say localhost 3000 API.days, let's see what it didn't like here. Yeah, I did this a few times already. So here, forgot my fat arrow. Try this again. So here I've got 2 days, but notice I don't have the actual office and I don't have the actual store. And that's easy enough to do, because what I could specify with my find all is that I want to do an include, and I'm going to end up including my models dot office and my models dot store. So now I've got my office and my store for these 2 days. Now I noticed something kind of interesting, that by default, I was getting back it seemed like I was getting my days sorted on when they ended up getting updated. I really want to get them back based on when they ended up getting created. And so what I'm going to end up doing here, and this kind of screwed me up a little bit, there might be an easier way to do it, is to put an order here. And if I just go over here and I put created at, what will end up happening if I go to run this By the way, notice I'm hanging here. So let's actually fix that. I don't want to hang. Not good. So I'm going to go over here and I'll do a catch with my next. And let's run this again. And it tells me that column created at with a lowercase a. Okay? And that's kind of an annoying thing, but that's just kind of what Postgres ends up doing. You have to be very explicit and basically put this inside of quotes. So I'm going to escape out some quotes, and when I end up doing that, I'll end up getting these back, and they're going to be based on sorted by the created at. Now, what I want to do here is that when I go into my app, right now, my days are over here, okay? And if I scroll down to the bottom, what I'm doing here is that I am sort of kicking off my process by rendering my day picker. Now, instead of getting my days from just sort of making them up, I'm going to end up getting them from my server. And the way that I'm going to end up doing that is to specify one of the things that I can do with the $sign is that I can make what's known as an AJAX request. Well, if you don't have experience with an AJAX request, what this allows you to do is that the browser is able to make an asynchronous request to the server behind the scenes. And I'm able to handle that response, okay? So you're basically able, without doing a full page reload, you're able to communicate back to the server. And the way that I'm going to do that, there's a couple of different libraries that you could use this. By the way, if you wanted to, you could use the native DOM methods to make an XML HTTP request. But it's a little bit of a pain to do. You have to look at, add some listeners to make sure that you're at the right phase of the request. What you can end up doing with AJAX, with jQuery, is to specify that you want to make a GET request to /API days. And this ends up giving us a promise. And I could go over here and put in days. And if I go over here, I could say console.log days. And just to see what this looks like, let's go back over here. I'm going to reload this page. And here I can see that I've got my two day objects here. And quite simply, when I go over here, I'm going to say state.days equals days. And I'm going to call my init method, which is going to render my day picker and my visit pickers. Right? So right now, I'm going to be part of the way home by having my two days over here. Of course, if I go to add a day, it'll sort of look like it's working, but if I refresh it, nothing will end up happening. So let's actually go in here, and this is kind of an idea of how often you should be committing. If I say get.status, get.diff, I can sort of see now get.add dot, get.commit, get days from server. So let's start out with what it's going to look like when we end up adding a day. This is going to be a pretty simplistic post here. So we'll go over here to my server. And I'm going to go over here and specify that when I go to post to /API days, on the server, I'm going to specify models.day.create. I don't really need to put anything here. I'm going to put a then, I'm going to get a day back, and I'll say response.send day. Just in case there's an error, I'll say catch next. So now I've got a route for going in and creating a day. Again, it's not wired up yet. If I go to add a day, right, this is not going to end up persisting. So I really could go back and forth over here between these two files. Okay? And what I really meant to say in terms of my components being dumb, my components don't know how to make AJAX requests. Okay? But if I come down here to on add day, then what I could do is I could say $$ dot post. And I could go to API days. I should end up getting a day back here. And if I get a day back here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that day, I'm going to push it over here. And again, I'm always at this point adding at the end. I have no mechanism for adding in the middle. That's a little bit more complicated. But if I do that, and this works out correctly, I should be able to add a day, and that day should be persisted. Okay? Again, let's start with the sort of high level, adding days and removing days. If I can add a day, then I should be able to go over here and say delete. Here I'm going to be passing an ID. I'm not going to be creating. I'm going to be destroying. What am I going to destroy? Where the ID is equal to request params ID. I have no data to send back. This is one of those where you could say, hey, look, I was successful. I'll just send back a status of 200. Okay? Once I end up doing that, again, this is not necessarily going to work. By the way, I'm seeding my days every time. That's why you see them end up disappearing. But if I go and add a day, I remove that day. That day is not removed yet. I need to go back to my app over here. And very similar to on add day, I'm going to go over here. And this is going to be, it's a little bit tricky because as far as I know, jQuery does not have a delete method. So what you're sort of, at least they didn't the last time I checked. So what you're forced to do is actually be a little bit more explicit. So this now will make an AJAX request, but now explicitly it's making it to this URL. And let's just do this. And I could specify that the method that I want to call is going to be delete. And in fact, once I end up doing this, I'm going to keep the same code that I had before. Right, I'm basically just going to splice away that day at the index. And the one thing that I'm missing from this is that I also need to put in, and I'm going to use my ES6, I need the ID of the day. And I could get that by specifying day equals state.days, state.idx. And if I go over here, I could put in $day.idx. So again, the $.post is really just internally a shortcut for AJAX's jQuery's $.ajax method. Again, as far as I know, they didn't have a delete last time I looked. So let's assume they still don't. Let's take a look and see what this buys us. So again, I should be back to, I'm here on 3 days. If I go to my third day, I remove the day. And here it looks like this is not working because, let's take a look. So let's take a look. State.days, state. Should be, or day.id, right? It's not going to be state.idx because I'm not deleting it by the index. I'm deleting it by the ID. So let's give that one more try. Go to the third day, remove it, and it should be removed. So at this point, I can add, and I can end up removing days. Now, there's any number of ways to handle. Something looks a little funky, right? I don't know. It's a good question. I think basically I was removing from the first day. Something is a little funky. Let's take a look here. Now, I did notice something that was happening before with me, but let's take a look here. So I'm splicing off, well, this doesn't look right. State splice state.days.index. This is where I think I'm getting screwed up. This is going to be a splice state. When I go to delete this day, this is going to be state.idx and set it then to 0. I think. Let's just see if that solves this problem. So if I go over here, I remove a day. Yeah, that looks a little better. Okay. So at this point, we could actually go in here, get.diff, get.add, get.commit. We'll go over here and we'll specify can add and remove days. Now, for the stuff that's a little bit trickier. So right now, I could add a day, and I could go over here and say we're going to go to the full stack office. And if I refresh this and go back to 3, I'll see that nothing ended up happening. And the way that I'm going to end up treating this route is a little bit tricky to do. Part of it has to do with jQuery. But I'm going to treat this as an edit of a day. So that I'm going to go and edit the day, and either I'm going to end up adding a store or adding an office, or I'll end up deleting a store or deleting an office. And the way that I'm going to do it is I'm going to go over here. I'm going to do a put. And this is going to be an ID. And the way that I'm going to end up doing that here is I'm going to say models.day, find one, params.id. This is going to then give me a day. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to do this in 2 steps. And I'm going to specify object assign. And I'm going to assign to the day my request.body. Now, one thing that I'm going to have to do here, if I'm going to end up using that request.body, is add in my body parser. And at this point, I'm going to return day.save. Now, let's actually, before we do this, just to be a little bit certain that I'm getting the entire day back, and you could draw this out at some point or turn this into a class method, is that I'm going to go over here and specify that what I want to return here is day, find by ID, and I'm going to grab this day ID back, and I'm going to go over here and put an include in, and I'm going to include my models.office and my models.store. So I want to get that full, complete day. Again, you might be better off pulling this out into some kind of class method. But once I do that, I'm going to go over here, and then I could say response.send day. And I could go over here just in case there was an error. I'm going to end up doing this. Now, again, one thing I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to get my body parser. So let me go up here. Const body parser equals require body parser. Now, I want to use my JSON body parser. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to say app dot use body parser JSON, meaning that my data is going to come in the form of JSON, and I want it to parse that data. Because there's one of four things that might happen. My store ID is going to be set to null, meaning I'm going to be deleting my store for that day. My office ID is going to be set to null. I'm going to be deleting my office visit for that day. My office ID is going to be set for a value. I'm adding an office visit. My store ID is going to be set to a value. I'm adding a store visit. So if we end up doing this, by the way, this is going to break. And it should break because I don't have body parser. In fact, I'm calling it body parsers. And let's npm install body parser. Save. So npm run start dev. Now we've got to wire this up. So again, all this stuff is going to end up getting wired up in these methods over here. So how's this going to work? Well, let's start by what we're going to do when we end up removing an office. This is going to be $.ajax. I'm going to cheat a little bit. When I went to delete, this was my URL. Let me use this. So when I end up going to remove an office, here's my day. It's not going to be a delete. It's going to be a put. Now, what I want to do here is that I want to actually go and I want to send some data here. Since I'm removing an office, I'm going to specify my data. And my data is going to be office ID null. At this point, I'm going to do a then. I'm going to get back a day. And I'm going to specify that my day's state.index is equal to the day that I'm getting back. And then I'm going to re-render my day view. Let me just point something out here. So this is going to happen when I remove an office. Okay? Let me just point something out. Even before I end up hitting this route. In fact, I'm going to comment this out for a moment. I'll show you why in a sec. I'm going to go over here. I'm going to rerun this. And I should have an office here, right? I'm going to click on it. Okay? Now it shows you that it can't find that route. That's fine. That I expect. But I want to show you something. Notice here, it's specifying that I've got form data. Specifying that it's URL encoded data that's going back. I don't want to have URL encoded data going back. I want to have JSON data that's going back. And the fact that I want to have JSON data going back, there's a couple of things that I need to do here. One of them is that when this data goes back, I'm going to specify that I want to stringify my data. Let's start out with that. Let's see what that gives us. So I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to reload this page. I'm going to end up clicking on this to get rid of an office. It's going to tell me that it can't find it. That's fine. And if I go over here, now it looks like it's giving me, I don't know if you could see this. Okay? It's still specifying form data. Okay? Now, what you really have to do is you have to tell jQuery, hey, look, jQuery, send a header. The reason why it's form data here is that on my request header, it specifies that the content type is, this is hard to see here, but it's actually URL encoded. If you went all the way over here, you could probably see it. What I want to do is I want to tell jQuery, hey, look, the content type here is going to be application JSON data. That's what's going up to the server. Okay? So now what I can end up doing here, again, this is not going to necessarily work. Let me clear out this route. By the way, I'm seeing all that other stuff because of my Google Maps. Let me just do something which I really wanted to do before, which is to just get rid of this silly Google Maps nonsense, since I'm not really using it, and just go over here and comment this out, just so I have a little less noise is pretty helpful here. Again, you're just sort of learning how to make AJAX requests to RESTful routes. So now if I reload this, I'll have a little bit less noise, which is nice. When I go to remove the office, I'll be in the same boat, but notice on the request headers, it tells us that it's JSON, and it's actually giving me a payload which looks a lot more like JSON data. And now, if I end up going back to my route, and I go back over here, I should be able to remove this office. Well, let's see what the error is. Response. Let's maybe see it over here. The argument passed to find one must be an options object, so let's take a look. I probably wanted to do find by ID. So find one, let me actually do find by ID, makes more sense. So let's delete the office. Let's see what the error is now. Day is not defined. It's going to be models.day. Let's try it one more time. And our office should go away, and it should be persistent in terms of going away. Let's wire up our store, which is not wired up yet, and it really is almost the exact same logic. You could really imagine drawing a lot of this stuff out. But if I go over here, I've got my onRemove office, my onRemove store. It's going to look almost identical. Again, just sort of thinking about it, the logic is find your day. This time it's store ID. That's going to be null. Okay, all the other settings are exactly the same, and this should give me the ability to delete a store, and that should be persisted as well. Last thing is that I want to be able to end up adding. Again, I could add, but it's not persisted. And these are really almost the exact same thing. I've got onRemove store. I'm going to go over here to on add store. So here this is going to be a put, but the store ID is not going to be null. It's going to be store.id. Right? And when I want to add an office, I'm going to go up here where I removed an office, go down here, and here this is going to be office ID, office ID. And let's just take a look and see if those work. So now I could add an office, maybe not. So adding a store seems to work. Adding an office does not. Let's see why. Office dot ID. So now I could add an office. I could add a day. And all of these are going to be persisted, right? So that's basically an idea of adding the biggest change, right? Just think about this for a second. Well, the biggest change is that things now are what? Asynchronous, right? I can't instantaneously add an office to a day. I can't instantaneously add a day. But look at the beauty of this sort of architecture. Again, the architecture of this application, all the stuff having to do with your AJAX calls, all the stuff having to do with the important part of your state changing is all in here. You've basically separated out what's going to be happening in terms of dealing with your state with how your day ends up getting rendered. Again, when you look at these dumb components, it's not nice to call them a dumb component, but if you look at these components, it should be obvious as to what's happening, okay? There shouldn't be any magic there. There shouldn't be anything globally happening there, okay? Anything that's passed in, you should end up using at some point over here, okay? Very explicit. One thing that I would probably do, especially if I was using ES6, is probably pass in an object here, so I wouldn't have to worry about the order. Did I pass in onRemoveOffice first, or did I pass in onRemoveStore first? But the key here, again, is that you're separating out your view functionality, okay, from logic that's happening in your business. So let's just say, just for the sake of argument, let's just say you had a cap on the number of days that you could add or something along these lines. You could put some of that logic in here if you wanted to. Again, maybe there's some logic based on a couple of different factors, okay? You could end up putting that logic in here, okay? But these are really all the ways that your state ended up changing. The only one that right now is not at all asynchronous, and we could probably make it asynchronous at some point, it's probably a little frustrating, is that you don't have your day pre-selected. And if we really wanted to do that, we could probably end up doing that by setting up either some kind of route for that, or more than likely setting up some kind of hash that we would end up looking for to pre-select a specific day. Anyway, let me stop this and I'll take some questions.